Thomas is a tank engine.
Everyone knows that.
But what does that actually mean? Why will saying Thomas the Train result in lumps of coal being thrown at you from rail enthusiasts?
Well, to those interested in steam trains, or locomotives, this should not come as a surprise, but there are several types of tank engine, and each one has its advantages and disadvantages.
Hopefully there's still something to learn in today's video, even for the most knowledgeable of Grisers. And if not, well done, you've earned your Master Engineer's certificate.
Well done, Master Engineer.
Let's take a look at why each one exists, and show some examples of some that you can visit in person today.
Firstly, let's clear up the basic facts. Thomas is not a train, he is a locomotive. A locomotive is a powered vehicle that pulls a train. A train is a row of coaches or trucks that is pulled along as a formation. There's also multiple units, which are essentially a mix of a locomotive and a train in one, and are almost always coupled together, not to confuse things. For steam power specifically, there are two main types of locomotive. There's tank engines and tender engines. Tank engines hold their fuel source on the locomotive itself, within a water tank. Tender engines, meanwhile, have a separate vehicle that carries the coal and water instead, leaving more room on the locomotive itself. The earliest forms of steam-powered railway traction were tender engines, with Novelty of 1829 technically being the first railway tank engine. Tender engines were favoured because separating the storage of fuel meant that the engine itself could be bigger and more powerful. Not loading coal and water onto the locomotive itself would be less damaging, and make all the parts easier to reach for maintenance. Especially in the days when all of the parts were wibbly-wobbly with hundreds of eccentric rods. Practically, the coal would need shoveling into the firebox, so having the storage of it placed right behind the cab made sense. However, having a tender engine means that there is an obstructed view of the line both in front and behind the driver, which is not ideal when running backwards. There is also a gap between them, which means that the two move independently from each other, and a fall plate has to be provided across the cab, as well as pipes for the water and any communications with the train. The friction between the steel wheels and the steel rails means that good adhesion is vital, and this is helped if the engine itself is heavy, pushing the wheels down. With less on the locomotive itself, tender engines with larger wheels tend to be prone to slipping. A tank engine, on the other hand, has the added coal and water to increase the weight upon the wheels, known as the axle loading. There is less of an obstructive view behind the driver, but sometimes the size of the water tank may still block the view of the line ahead. Typically being smaller, tank engines are more agile around restricted sites, but tend not to be able to hold as much coal and water as a tender, so are not good for travelling long distances. Now that we've cleared that up, why are there so many different types of tank engine? There are four main categories, those being side tanks, saddle tanks, well tanks, and pannier tanks. All of these are related to where the water is stored. There is not a different name for where the coal is stored, if the engine burns coal, that is. This is kept in a bunker, mostly behind the cab, but in some instances in a space in front or within the cab itself.
Side tanks are probably the most recognisable, as Thomas is one of these, and that essentially means that the water is kept in tanks that are on the side of the locomotive, sitting on the running board.
This was most common for suburban designs, as there was plenty of capacity to run without topping up throughout the city. When the water did need replenishing, it was easy enough to reach from one of the platform level water cranes. They were also easy to clean, and to stand on top of, or to use the flat surface to store various tools. Passenger trains desired smoother journeys, so the low centre of gravity would assist in making these engines stable. Logistically, there had to be a separate water tank on either side to balance out the weight, and these were connected by a pipe running underneath. So by filling up the water on one side, the water would even out on the other. This was a slow process, which often meant needing to turn the tap off to wait for it to balance out. Or mistakenly thinking that the tank was full, when really it was only full on one side. The biggest disadvantage of having two big water tanks is that it blocked access to most of the engine. For oiling and maintenance to the motion, loco crews would either need to become contortionists and work around the front of the tank, or to climb from underneath the loco, which does not offer much space.
This is where pannier tanks were introduced, as they bear similarities to side tanks, except they raise the bar a little higher. Instead, now the water tank is bolted to the side of the boiler, which leaves plenty of room underneath.
The Great Western Railway particularly loved these, as it made access to lubrication points much easier from the running board. There is still a balance pipe between them, and less capacity than most side tank engines, but just as much room on top to keep things like fire irons, or to stand on like a podium. Having the tanks attached to the boiler does mean a lot more strain on it, and heavy bracing had to be implemented underneath to keep it secure. Being higher up, pannier tanks therefore have a higher centre of gravity, and the water on either side of this can make them waddle a bit as it sloshes about. Other tank engines do this too though, and it's actually not where the name for duck in the Railway series came from. The Reverend W. Awdry actually nicknamed the character this after his children noticed that his model of Montague tended to wobble from side to side due to a twisted axle. A happy but amusing coincidence.
Pannier tanks get their name from horse riding terminology. As with motorbikes, there is storage on either side. Saddle tanks are much the same, in that the name derives from a saddle on a horse, and in the case of locomotives, the water tank sits on top of the boiler, like a saddle.
These designs encase the outside of the boiler in one tank, which means that filling up on water is often much easier. But the loco crews have to climb up pretty high in order to do so. As a curved, flat surface, these are the worst when it comes to safe working at height. Saddle tanks are space efficient, but the most disruptive to a crew's vision. They are also fuel efficient, as by following the shape of the boiler, they help it to maintain its temperature. Escaping heat actually helps to warm up the water in the tank before it's turned to steam in the boiler, meaning pressure can be raised quicker. However, many of these steam injectors to put water into the boiler work less effectively when they get too hot. So this warm water can lead to them playing up, and subsequently the firemen cussing and swearing when they need to add more water. There is plenty of space to work underneath, but having so much weight at the top of the loco means that these are the most rough riding tank engines. This is why you'll mostly find these designs in industrial use. As a side note, Percy is a saddle tank engine, but his look quite suddenly changes between the books. The earliest paintings of him show the saddle tank wrapping entirely round the boiler, which is not something you would find on a real engine, but perhaps in a butterfly sanctuary. Later artists depict him with a more sensible saddle tank, which stops halfway around the boiler.
At the opposite end of the scale is the well tank, and they're doing okay. Probably the least known of the four, this comes from the idea that the water tank is stored underneath the boiler, therefore in a well.
They tend to have the smallest capacity as the tank has to fit around the frames, the axles, the firebox, any motion, and all the relevant pipework. The immediate issue then is that well tanks don't have such a good range, and they make it difficult to access underneath the loco. Technically not below the boiler, engines such as Dolgoch on the Talyllyn Railway also have a back water tank, running into a well tank underneath. The best bit about this is that it offers a nice seat for the crew in the cab, but not when it overflows with water and makes it like a bench in the rain. Ugh. Whereas other forms are big enough to allow fitters to climb inside and repair the interior, there isn't any room to retrieve anything that falls into a well tank. They're also much more complex to remove if they need repairs, whereas other forms can simply have the tanks lifted off. What they do result in is the lowest centre of gravity that you could find, so on paper they are much more stable than any other locomotive. Again, this is something that the Reverend W. Awdry personified with Skarloey and Rheneas. Less common iterations of tank engines include wing tanks, which were basically just side tanks, but running along the smoke box instead, so that the boiler was accessible. And inverted saddle tanks, which run underneath instead, helping to support it. Some engines also have combinations of different forms, such as the George England or mainline Hunslet designs at the Festiniog Railway. These are known as tender tanks, as they hold the water in a traditional saddle tank on the engine, but the coal is kept separately in a tender. They could, in theory, run for short distances without being coupled to the tender. Linda and Blanche were in fact converted from tank engines.
Locos such as the Caledonian Railway 264 class, that one that everyone had a model of growing up, would occasionally be coupled to a coal truck to make a makeshift tender, which meant that they didn't have to refill the coal as often. On the reverse side, a tender engine could also become a tank engine.
A good example is the Great Western's Dean Goods class, which during World War II, many such locos were requisitioned by the War Department. To increase their range in mainland Europe, that is their water capacity, not their rifles, They hastily had pannier tanks strapped to the side of the boiler, and pumps so that they could source water from nearby streams.
On the topic of tenders, there weren't so many variations of these, as what was simplest was to have a sloped water tank, with a coal space on top, meaning that it would naturally fall towards the cab and make it easier to shovel into the firebox.
Flying Scotsman is a fun example though, as it is currently fitted with a tender that has a corridor going through it. This allows the loco crews to change place with a relief crew waiting in the carriages, without the need to stop the train. In 1966, Alan Pegler bought a second corridor tender and had it fitted to carry only water. Coupled behind the existing coal and water tender, this meant that Flying Scotsman could carry 11,000 gallons of water, which was useful in an age when water towers and troughs were being taken away by British Railways. Many mainline tender engines had scoops that could be lowered into reservoirs between the rails, allowing water to be forced up into the tender so that the loco's supply could be replenished on the move. Tank engines didn't really have the space for these, and the jobs they performed typically meant that they didn't need them.
Another exception, which is not quite a tank engine or a tender engine, is the Garratt, which is so unique that it sits in its own classification of locos, and I don't even have a model of one to show you.
These articulated engines had two sets of powered bogies, with the boiler pivoting between them. On each end was a separate tender, the front being for water and the rear for both water and fuel. With double the cylinders, they would therefore need extra water to feed them with steam. Their design meant that they were extremely powerful, whilst still being able to navigate tight corners.
So many different ways to store water on a steam engine, and it does affect how they are distinguished. Locomotives are classified by their wheel arrangement, and tank engines also had the suffix to denote what type they were. Side tanks were simply T for tank, whereas saddle tanks were ST, pannier tanks PT, and well tanks WT, with the rare occasion when there's a tender tank being known as TT.
It is quite amusing that the Reverend W. Awdry always saw Thomas as a tank engine, but not necessarily as a particular type. His earliest drawings saw him as something akin to an LNER J50, whereas in the illustrations he resembles a squished LBSCR E2. In fan letters, he is even mentioned to be something like an LMS Ginty. But, above all, he is a tank engine. Every big railway company had these little engines working in shunting yards, or industrial sites, branch lines, piloting at big stations, or taking suburban trains. And as useful as he might be, Thomas is simply one of these. Not a tank's engine, but certainly a tank engine.
Last time we looked at how steam locomotives get their coal, and I hope you've enjoyed today's video talking about how they store their water. I'd love to know if you have a favourite engine of all of the ones we've discussed, or as I've previously talked about, maybe you've got one that you tend not to like as often. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, as maybe there's a clear winner and we can pick out and argue amongst ourselves over steam engines. Do consider subscribing, as on the first Friday of every month there is a new instalment of Guide Rail exploring the world's steam-powered history. And I'm also on Patreon for anyone who wishes to support the channel. Thanks.
The following patrons are super fantastic for supporting the channel: Alex Goodman, GBH Train, D0280 Falcon, Sean Tempest, Random Thomas Fan, Dark White 73, Andrew Dyack, Reese Lee Walter, Ryan RTS, Ewan Pentland, Steam Power 4472, Jude 72, Firewind 10, Luneacres Photography, Mario Sonic 64, Elias, and Soda Fox Art.